The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the Double R Ranch as Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow with a weathered bandana. It was July 15, 1981, and the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees before noon. The drought that had plagued East Texas for months showed no signs of letting up, turning the once green pastures into a patchwork of brown and yellow. Jake had been working the Double R for nearly 15 years, ever since he'd returned from Vietnam with a Purple Heart and a limp that reminded him daily of the shrapnel still lodged in his left leg. At 38, he was considered one of the best horse trainers in Henderson County, with a reputation for gentling even the most stubborn Mustangs. "Jake," called out Tom Richardson, the ranch owner, as he approached the main corral. Tom was a third-generation rancher whose family had owned this land since the 1920s. His weathered face and calloused hands told the story of a man who'd spent his entire life working under the Texas sun. "How's Thunder coming along?" Thunder was a magnificent black stallion, standing 16 hands high with a white star on his forehead and 3 white socks. Tom had purchased him 6 months earlier from a breeder in Oklahoma, paying top dollar for what he believed would be the crown jewel of his breeding program. The horse had arrived with impeccable bloodlines, but a temperament that had proven challenging for even the most experienced handlers. "He's making progress," Jake replied, adjusting his worn Stetson. "Still got some fight in him, but he's starting to trust me. Give me another month, and he'll be ready for anything." Jake had been working with Thunder daily, using the patience and intuition that had made him legendary among local ranchers. The stallion had initially been aggressive and unpredictable, rearing and striking at anyone who approached. But Jake had seen something special in the horse's intelligent dark eyes, a spirit that reminded him of the wild Mustangs he'd encountered during his childhood in West Texas. The training sessions had become a dance of mutual respect. Each morning at dawn, Jake would enter Thunder's paddock with nothing but a halter and lead rope, speaking in low, soothing tones. He'd learned to read the horse's body language, the flick of an ear, the position of his head, the tension in his muscles. Slowly but surely, Thunder had begun to respond, allowing Jake to brush him, pick up his hooves, and eventually saddle him. "I've got some buyers coming next week," Tom said, leaning against the fence rail. "Word's gotten out about Thunder, and there's serious interest from a ranch up in Oklahoma. They're talking about using him for their cutting horse program." Jake nodded, but felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Over the months of working with Thunder, he'd developed a bond with the stallion that went beyond the typical trainer-horse relationship. There was an understanding between them, a communication that transcended words. The afternoon training session went better than usual. Thunder responded to Jake's commands with increasing willingness, his movements fluid and controlled. Jake had fitted him with his favorite saddle, a hand-tooled leather piece his grandfather had made in the 1940s. The saddle was Jake's most prized possession, decorated with intricate silver conchos and bearing the initials JM carved into the leather. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake decided to take Thunder for a ride along the perimeter fence. It would be good for the horse to experience the ranch boundaries and get accustomed to different terrain. They rode in comfortable silence, the only sounds being the rhythmic clip-clop of Thunder's hooves on the hard-packed earth and the distant lowing of cattle. Jake felt the familiar peace that came from being on horseback, a sensation that had helped him through the darkest days following his return from the war. As they approached the eastern boundary of the ranch, near where the property bordered the dense pine forests of the Sabine National Forest, Thunder suddenly tensed beneath him. The horse's ears pricked forward, and his nostrils flared as he caught a scent that Jake couldn't detect. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, but Thunder was already dancing sideways, his eyes wide with alarm. The sound came without warning, a sharp crack that echoed through the trees like a gunshot. Later, Jake would realize it was probably just a dead branch falling, weakened by the drought and finally succumbing to its own weight. But in that moment, Thunder exploded into motion. The stallion reared high, his front hooves pawing the air, and Jake felt himself sliding backward in the saddle. He tried to regain his balance, but Thunder came down hard and immediately bolted toward the tree line. Jake pulled back on the reins, but the horse was beyond reasoning, driven by some primal fear that overrode months of careful training. They crashed through the underbrush at breakneck speed, branches whipping past Jake's face and tearing at his clothes. He could feel Thunder's powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath him as the horse navigated fallen logs and dense vegetation with the agility of a wild animal. "Whoa, Thunder, easy!" Jake shouted, but his words were lost in the thunder of hooves and the crash of breaking branches. A low-hanging branch caught Jake across the chest, and he felt his grip on the reins slip. The world spun as he was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the forest floor with a sickening thud. Pain exploded through his injured leg, and for a moment everything went black. When Jake regained consciousness, the forest was eerily quiet. He could hear Thunder's hoofbeats growing fainter in the distance, but the stallion was already beyond calling back. Jake tried to stand, but immediately collapsed as his leg gave out beneath him. The old war wound had been aggravated by the fall, and he could feel warm blood seeping through his jeans. Using a fallen branch as a makeshift crutch, Jake began the painful journey back to the ranch house. Each step sent waves of agony through his leg, and by the time he emerged from the tree line, the sun had completely set, leaving only the pale light of a crescent moon to guide his way. Tom Richardson was waiting by the corral with several ranch hands, their faces etched with worry. They'd heard the commotion and had been preparing to mount a search party. "Jake, what happened? Where's Thunder?" Tom called out as he rushed to help the injured trainer. "He spooked," Jake gasped, leaning heavily on Tom's shoulder. "Something in the woods set him off. He's gone, Tom. Headed deep into the forest with my saddle still on him." As the ranch hands helped Jake to the house where Tom's wife, Mary, began tending to his wounds, Tom organized search parties to begin looking for Thunder at first light. But deep in his heart, Jake feared they might never see the magnificent stallion again. The Sabine National Forest stretched for hundreds of thousands of acres, a vast wilderness where a horse could disappear without a trace. As Jake lay in the guest bedroom, his leg elevated and wrapped in bandages, he stared out the window at the dark tree line and wondered if Thunder was still running, still carrying the saddle that bore his grandfather's craftsmanship into the unknown depths of the East Texas wilderness. Dawn broke gray and humid over the Double R Ranch on July the 16th, 1981. Jake Morrison sat on the edge of the guest bed, testing his weight on his injured leg. The pain was manageable, but Doc Henderson had been clear during his late-night visit. No riding for at least 2 weeks. The old shrapnel had shifted during the fall, and any further trauma could cause permanent damage. "You're not going anywhere, Jake," Mary Richardson said firmly as she entered with a breakfast tray. Mary was a no-nonsense woman who'd raised 3 children and managed ranch hands for 20 years. When she used that tone, even the toughest cowboys listened. "Tom's got plenty of help for the search." Through the window, Jake could see the organized chaos of the search preparation. Tom had called in favors from neighboring ranches, and by sunrise, nearly 24 riders had assembled in the main yard. The men stood in small groups, checking their gear and discussing search patterns while their horses stamped impatiently in the morning heat. Sheriff Bobby Caldwell had arrived just after dawn in his brown and tan patrol car, a 1979 Ford LTD that had seen better days. Bobby was a longtime friend of the Richardson family and understood the value of a horse like Thunder, not just in monetary terms, but in what he represented to the ranch's future. "We'll start with a grid pattern," Sheriff Caldwell announced to the assembled searchers. "The Forest Service has agreed to let us use their fire roads, and I've got topographical maps showing every trail and creek bed within a 20-mile radius." Jake watched from the window as Tom divided the men into teams of 3. Each team would take a different section of the forest, following deer trails and old logging roads that crisscrossed the wilderness. They carried CB radios, a relatively new technology that Tom had invested in the previous year for ranch operations. "Team Alpha, you take the northern sector along Pine Hill Creek," Tom called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Team Bravo, head southeast toward the old lumber camp. Everyone stays in radio contact, and nobody goes more than 5 miles in without checking back." The search teams mounted up and rode out in different directions, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust in the dry morning air. Jake felt helpless watching them disappear into the tree line, knowing that his intimate knowledge of Thunder's behavior could be crucial to finding the stallion. As the morning wore on, the CB radio in Tom's kitchen crackled with periodic reports. "Team Charlie to base, we've found some tracks near the old bridge, but they're heading deeper into the timber. Team Delta here, no sign along the fire road, moving to Sector 7. By noon, the temperature had climbed past 95 degrees, and the search teams were rotating back to the ranch house for water and rest. The men's faces were flushed and sweaty, their shirts soaked through despite the early hour. "Found some broken branches about 3 miles in," reported Charlie Hendricks, a weathered cowboy from the neighboring Lazy S Ranch. "Looked like something big crashed through there, but the trail goes cold at the creek bed." Jake hobbled out to the porch, unable to stay inside any longer. "Charlie, was there any sign of the saddle? Maybe leather caught on a branch?" "Nothing like that, Jake. But I'll tell you what, whatever went through there was moving fast and didn't care what was in its way." The afternoon search proved equally fruitless. The teams pushed deeper into the forest, following game trails and creek beds, but Thunder seemed to have vanished completely. The Sabine National Forest was a maze of pine thickets, swampland, and dense undergrowth that could easily conceal a horse, especially one as intelligent as Thunder. As evening approached, Tom made the difficult decision to call off the search for the day. "We'll start again at first light," he announced to the tired and frustrated searchers. "I want to thank everyone for their help. We'll find him." But privately, Tom was beginning to worry. A horse could survive in the wild for a while, especially one as strong and resourceful as Thunder. But the saddle was another matter. If it shifted or became tangled in the underbrush, it could seriously injure or even kill the stallion. That night, Jake lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and somewhere out there, he hoped, the sound of Thunder's breathing. The stallion had been his responsibility, and the weight of that failure pressed down on him like a physical burden. The search continued for 5 more days. Tom hired a helicopter pilot from Tyler to conduct aerial reconnaissance, but the thick canopy of pine trees made it nearly impossible to spot anything from above. Local newspapers picked up the story, and soon the R Ranch was receiving calls from as far away as Dallas, offering help and advice. On July 22nd, a week after Thunder's disappearance, the search teams made their most significant discovery. Deep in the forest, nearly 8 miles from where Thunder had bolted, they found clear evidence of the stallion's passage, hoofprints in the soft mud beside a creek, and caught on a thorny bush, several long black hairs that could only have come from Thunder's mane. "He's alive," Jake said with relief when Tom brought him the news. "And he's moving northwest, toward the deeper wilderness." But that was the last sign they would find. Despite expanding the search area and bringing in tracking dogs from the state police, Thunder had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The forest had reclaimed one of its own, and the magnificent black stallion had become part of the legend and mystery of the East Texas wilderness. After 2 weeks of searching, Tom reluctantly called off the organized effort. The cost was becoming prohibitive, and the other ranch operations couldn't be neglected indefinitely, but he made it clear that the search wasn't over, just postponed. "We'll keep our ears open," he told Jake as they stood looking out at the tree line. "Hunters, loggers, Forest Service workers, someone will spot him eventually. A horse like Thunder doesn't just disappear forever." Jake nodded, but in his heart, he wondered if they would ever see the stallion again. The Sabine National Forest was vast and unforgiving, and Thunder was now part of its wild heart, carrying Jake's grandfather's saddle deeper into a wilderness that had swallowed countless secrets over the decades. The years passed like pages turning in a book that Jake Morrison couldn't quite bring himself to close. By 1985, the R Ranch had acquired new horses, and the daily routines had settled into familiar patterns, but the memory of Thunder haunted every sunset that painted the East Texas sky. Jake had recovered fully from his injuries, though his leg ached more on humid days, serving as a constant reminder of that July evening when everything changed. He'd continued working for Tom Richardson, training horses with the same patience and skill that had made him legendary, but something fundamental had shifted in his approach to the work. "You're different with them now," Tom observed one afternoon as they watched Jake work with a young quarter horse in the round pen. "More careful, maybe?" Jake paused in his training, considering Tom's words. "Maybe I learned something about respecting what's wild in them," he replied. "Thunder taught me that some spirits can't be completely tamed, no matter how much trust you build." The local newspapers had moved on to other stories, but Thunder's disappearance had become part of East Texas folklore. Coffee shop conversations in Marshall and Carthage often included speculation about the ghost horse of the Sabine Forest. Some claimed to have seen a black stallion drinking from remote creeks at dawn, while others swore they'd heard the sound of hoofbeats echoing through the pines on still nights. Jake had investigated every reported sighting personally, driving his 1978 Ford pickup down logging roads and hiking into the forest with a halter and lead rope just in case. Each time, he'd found nothing but tracks that could have belonged to any number of wild horses that roamed the area, descendants of animals that had escaped or been abandoned over the decades. The Forest Service rangers knew Jake by name now. Whenever they encountered unusual signs during their patrols, they'd radio the information to Sheriff Caldwell, who would pass it along to the ranch. But as the months turned into years, even these reports became less frequent. In 1987, a logging crew working near the Louisiana border claimed they'd seen a black horse with something on its back, possibly a saddle, watching them from a ridge about a quarter-mile away. By the time they'd climbed up to investigate, the animal had vanished, leaving only hoofprints in the soft earth and broken branches where it had passed. Jake had driven the 150 miles to the site, spending 3 days camping in the area and following every trail he could find. He'd discovered evidence that horses had been in the area recently, droppings rubbed bark on trees where they'd scratched, and a network of paths through the underbrush that suggested regular use. But Thunder remained as elusive as ever. "He's out there," Jake told Mary Richardson as she served him coffee in the ranch house kitchen. "I can feel it. He's learned to live wild, but he's still out there." Mary had become like a mother to Jake over the years, especially after his own parents had passed away in a car accident in 1983. She worried about his obsession with finding Thunder, but she also understood the bond between a man and a horse that transcended ordinary relationships. "Maybe that's where he belongs now," she said gently. "Maybe he was never meant to be anyone's horse." The thought troubled Jake more than he cared to admit. Had he failed Thunder by trying to domesticate something that was fundamentally wild? Or had Thunder's escape been a rejection of everything Jake had tried to teach him about trust and partnership? In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and the world seemed to be changing rapidly around the quiet rhythms of ranch life. Jake had turned 46 that year, and his dark hair was showing streaks of gray at the temples. He'd never married, though he'd had opportunities. The other ranch hands joked that he was married to his work, but Jake knew the truth was more complicated than that. The search for Thunder had become a defining part of his identity, a quest that gave meaning to his days beyond the routine of training horses and mending fences. Every time he rode the perimeter of the ranch, he found himself looking toward the tree line, hoping to catch a glimpse of a familiar silhouette. Tom Richardson had prospered over the years, expanding his operation and building a reputation for quality breeding stock, but he'd never replaced Thunder as the centerpiece of his program. The stallion's bloodlines had been too valuable to replicate easily, and the memory of what might have been cast a shadow over every new acquisition. "I still get calls about him," Tom told Jake one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Horse traders, breeders, even some folks from Hollywood who heard the story and want to make a movie about it. But I tell them all the same thing. Thunder's not for sale because Thunder's not ours to sell anymore." The story had indeed spread beyond East Texas. Western magazines had picked up the tale, and it had been featured in several books about mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena. Each retelling added new details and embellishments until the truth became obscured by legend. Some versions claimed Thunder had been seen leading a herd of wild horses through the deepest parts of the forest. Others suggested he'd been spotted as far away as Arkansas or Louisiana, always carrying the distinctive saddle that marked him as something more than just another feral horse. Jake had learned to be skeptical of these reports, but he investigated them anyway. Each false lead was another small disappointment, but also a reminder that people were still looking, still hoping to solve the mystery of the vanished stallion. As 1990 approached, Jake began to accept that Thunder might never be found. The horse would be 15 years old now, still in his prime, but no longer the young stallion who had bolted into the forest 9 years earlier. If he had survived, and Jake chose to believe he had, Thunder would have adapted completely to life in the wild, becoming something new and different from the animal Jake had known. But late at night, when the wind moved through the pines and carried the scents of the deep forest across the ranch, Jake would sometimes step out onto the porch and listen. Somewhere out there in the vast wilderness of the Sabine National Forest, a black stallion might still be running free, carrying a piece of Jake's past on his back like a badge of honor, earned through courage and determination. The mystery endured, becoming part of the landscape itself, as permanent and unchanging as the ancient pines that guarded their secrets in the heart of East Texas. November 15th, 1993. The morning air carried the crisp bite of the first real cold front of the season, as Bobby Caldwell, now sheriff for over a decade, sat in his office reviewing incident reports. At 52, Bobby had seen enough of human nature to rarely be surprised anymore, but the call that came in at 8:47 a.m. would prove to be different. "Sheriff's office," he answered on the second ring. "Sheriff Caldwell, this is Dale Murphy. I'm calling from a payphone at the Texaco station on Highway 59, about 20 miles north of Marshall." The voice was shaky, uncertain. I think we found something you need to see." Dale Murphy and his hunting partner, Carl Stevens, had been tracking deer through a remote section of the Sabine National Forest since before dawn. Both men were experienced hunters who'd been working these woods for over 20 years, but what they'd discovered that morning was unlike anything they'd ever encountered. "We were following a game trail about 12 miles northeast of the old lumber camp," Dale explained when Sheriff Caldwell arrived at the scene 2 hours later. Carl spotted something that didn't look right through the trees. The location was deep in the forest, accessible only by an overgrown logging road that hadn't been used since the early 1980s. Ancient pine trees towered overhead, their canopy so thick that, even at midday, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. The air was heavy with the scent of pine needles and decomposing leaves. Carl Stevens, a quiet man in his 50s who worked at the local paper mill, led the way along a barely visible deer path. "It's about a quarter-mile in," he said, his voice subdued. "We almost walked right past it." They emerged into a small clearing where a massive pine had fallen years earlier, creating a gap in the canopy that allowed filtered sunlight to reach the forest floor. And there, partially concealed by undergrowth and the passage of time, lay the skeletal remains of a horse. But it wasn't just any horse. Even after 12 years in the elements, certain details were unmistakable. The skeleton was large, indicating a horse of significant size and breeding. And draped across the remains, weathered but still recognizable, was a leather saddle. Sheriff Caldwell approached slowly, his trained eye taking in every detail. The saddle was hand-tooled leather, decorated with silver conchos that had tarnished to a dull gray. Despite years of exposure to weather, the craftsmanship was still evident. And there, carved into the leather of the saddle skirt, were the initials J.M. "Jesus," Bobby whispered, recognizing immediately what they'd found. "It's Thunder." The discovery sent shockwaves through the local community. Within hours, word had spread to every ranch, coffee shop, and gathering place in East Texas. The mystery that had captivated the region for over a decade finally had an answer, though it wasn't the one anyone had hoped for. Jake Morrison received the call at 3:15 p.m. while he was working with a young colt in the training ring. Tom Richardson's voice was heavy with emotion as he delivered the news. "They found him, Jake. They found Thunder." The drive to the forest seemed to take forever, though Jake knew it was only 45 minutes from the ranch. His hands gripped the steering wheel of his pickup truck so tightly, his knuckles were white, and his mind raced with a mixture of grief and relief. After 12 years of wondering, of hoping, of searching, he finally had an answer. The Forest Service had cordoned off the area, and several vehicles were parked along the old logging road when Jake arrived. Sheriff Caldwell met him at the tree line, his expression somber. "Jake, I want you to know, it looks like he lived for quite a while out here. The bones show no signs of trauma or injury. Best guess is he lived wild for years before age caught up with him." The walk to the clearing felt like a pilgrimage. Jake's leg ached from the uneven terrain, but he pressed on, driven by a need to see for himself what had become of the magnificent stallion he'd trained and lost so many years ago. When they reached the site, Jake stood in silence for a long time, taking in the scene. The skeleton was positioned as if Thunder had simply laid down to rest and never gotten up again. The saddle, his grandfather's masterpiece, had remained with the horse through all those years in the wilderness. "He never got it off," Jake said quietly, kneeling beside the remains. "All those years, and he carried it with him." The leather was cracked and faded, stained by weather and time, but the basic structure remained intact. Jake could see where Thunder had rubbed against trees, trying to remove the saddle, but the cinch had held fast. The horse had learned to live with it, adapting to its presence as he adapted to life in the wild. "There's something else," Sheriff Caldwell said gently. "We found tracks around the area, fresh ones. It looks like other horses have been coming here regularly." Indeed, the clearing showed signs of frequent visitation. Hoof prints crisscrossed the area, and several trees bore the marks of horses rubbing against them. It appeared that Thunder's final resting place had become a gathering spot for the wild horses of the forest, as if they were paying their respects to a fallen leader. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived at the site. Tom Richardson came with several ranch hands, and word spread through the hunting and ranching community like wildfire. By evening, nearly 50 people had made the trek into the forest to see the remains of the legendary stallion. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a veterinarian from Marshall who specialized in equine medicine, examined the skeleton and confirmed what everyone already suspected. Based on the bone structure and the wear patterns on the teeth, this horse lived to be at least 20 years old, she reported. That means he survived in the wild for approximately 8 years after his escape. The revelation was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Thunder had not only survived his flight into the wilderness, but had thrived, living free for nearly a third of his life. The saddle that Jake had feared would be his doom had instead become a part of him, a reminder of his domesticated past that he carried into his wild future. As the sun set through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, Jake made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "I want to leave him here," he announced. "This is where he chose to be. This is where he belongs." Tom Richardson started to object. The saddle alone was worth several $1,000s, and Thunder's remains could be moved to the ranch for a proper memorial. But Jake held up his hand. "He earned his freedom," Jake said firmly. "He lived his life on his own terms and he died free. That saddle was my grandfather's, but it became Thunder's. Let it stay with him." The decision was controversial, but it was Jake's to make. The Forest Service agreed to designate the area as a memorial site, and a small plaque was installed on a nearby tree, reading simply, "Thunder, 1975-1993, he ran free." Over the years that followed, the site became a pilgrimage destination for horse lovers and those who believed in the power of freedom and wildness. The wild horses continued to visit the clearing, and many people reported seeing them there, standing quietly among the trees as if keeping vigil over their fallen leader. Jake returned to the site every year on the anniversary of Thunder's escape, bringing fresh flowers and spending a few quiet hours in the clearing. He never regretted his decision to leave the stallion, where he'd chosen to make his final rest. The story of Thunder's discovery made national news, and the tale of the horse who lived free for 8 years in the East Texas wilderness became part of American folklore. Books were written, documentaries were made, and the legend grew with each telling. But for Jake Morrison, now in his 50s, and still training horses on the Double R Ranch, the story was simpler and more personal. Thunder had taught him that some spirits are too wild to be completely tamed, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. As he stood in the clearing on that November evening in 1993, watching the last light fade through the pine trees, Jake felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for 12 years. Thunder was home, and the mystery that had defined so much of Jake's life was finally complete. The black stallion had run his race and run it well, carrying a piece of the past into an uncertain future, and proving that freedom, once tasted, can never truly be forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the East Texas wilderness and the legend of Thunder. If this story moved you as much as it moved us to tell it, please give this video a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what you thought about Thunder's remarkable tale of freedom and survival. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories that will touch your heart and inspire your spirit. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, and we'll see you in the next video with another unforgettable story. Until then, remember that sometimes the greatest adventures happen when we have the courage to run free.